Welcome to Convergence Live. This is the first in a series of lively discussions about urgent challenges in public life. These conversations are an opportunity for critical debate with civility and an open mind, because everything we do here at Convergence is premised on the firm belief that we can disagree without hating each other, and we can find common ground across even the deepest ideological divides. With that in mind, I am so thrilled to welcome our esteemed guests to this first Convergence Live. We're joined today by Heidi Legg, Research Fellow at the Institute for Quantitative Social Science at Harvard University, and Ari Cohn, Free Speech Counsel at Tech Freedom. Heidi is an American-Canadian journalist. She's written extensively about the media landscape. Her work includes The Fight Against Disinformation in America, a landscape study of emerging models in local news, and Preserving America's Thought Leader magazines, and How Trust Intersects with Subscription. She's written for the Boston Globe, the Globe and Mail, CNN, The Atlantic, and more. Heidi founded the editorial.com in 2012. She's currently helping to build the Future of Media project at Harvard, tracking funding sources for national media, and she serves on the board of the Center for Community News, where she works to strengthen the future of local news. Ari is an experienced First Amendment and defamation attorney who has dedicated his career to protecting civil liberties from government intrusion, which is central to the discussion that Convergence is having about digital discourse today. Prior to his opening his own practice, Ari served as director of the Individual Rights Defense Program at the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or FIRE. He defended the free speech rights of students and faculty members at colleges and universities and co-authored amicus briefs to state and federal courts across the country on vital First Amendment issues. Before joining FIRE, Ari was a litigation associate at the Chicago office of Meyer Brown LLP, where he represented multinational businesses in high-stakes commercial litigation. So today's discussion is about the promise and problems in online discourse and how we can take the toxicity out of digital spaces. Ari and Heidi come to this discussion with different perspectives on what ails online discourse. They are both current participants in the Convergence Dialogue on Digital Discourse for a Thriving Democracy. It's a long-term collaboration of diverse leaders from relevant fields. This is what Convergence does best. And unlike our collaborative dialogues, which take time to create common ground and identify actionable solutions, today's discussion is a chance for Heidi and Ari to explore the big sticking points and their strongest arguments in a more casual format and with all of us. We've collected feedback in advance on areas that viewers are most interested in, and we'll do our best to address as many of those today as we can. We will also provide opportunities for feedback on this format after the event and additional information about future discussions like this one. So with that in mind, it is my pleasure to introduce your host for this discussion, CEO of Convergence, David Eisner.
Thank you, Meg. It is wonderful to be here with you, Heidi, and with you, Ari. I'm really looking forward to your discussion. Getting going, I want to reflect that one of the findings from Convergence's discovery report, which has been released this week, and which will sets the frame for the larger Convergence Collaborative, is there's a common misperception that people's viewpoints on solutions around digital disinformation hinge on their political affiliation, a pretty binary perspective. And although political leaning is certainly part of the equation, we discovered that it's actually determined more by Americans' views around free expression and privacy than on overall politics. And I'm interested in whether this may play out a little bit in our discussion today. So to begin, let's talk briefly about what you think ails digital discourse and what's causing this problem and challenge that we're all so focused on. What, in your view, is the fundamental problem that needs solving? Heidi, why don't you start?
Thank you, David. Thank you for having us. It's actually been very fascinating to be part of the Convergence series and meet a whole bunch of stakeholders from different parts of all of these things that come together to give us our digital dialogue today. we've sort of have this melding pot of us all being in one place through the internet, which we couldn't do before, and is super exciting and a positive in many ways. The problem for me, when I look at what ails us, is that I was in San Francisco in the mid-90s, very excited about the internet, still excited about the internet. We can even talk about ChatGPT today, because I definitely think there's some exciting things and some fear in that. So I love innovation, but we've had no guardrails. And so when I look at the landscape, which is what I do a lot, I study a landscape of media, and then I write about it, or I source who funds it. And I do have a pretty good handle right now on the landscape in America and in Canada on the media. The places that I keep pulling strings are around either Section 230. Can we revise that? I don't know how we revise it, but can we at least have that conversation?
Can you share really quickly, Heidi, what Section 230 is?
Sure. So Section 230, Ari should be doing this part. He's the expert in legalese. But basically, it was a law made in the Communications Decency Act. Clinton was still president. It's the mid-1990s. The internet's come along. Everybody's excited. Anybody who was 18 to 25 was out to San Francisco, this gold rush called the internet. And it was a law that said that an open and free system, I should find it and read it because I have it here for you, that basically having an open and free internet will be good for society. And one of the things that's really important about that, and I don't want to dive into that because I want to tell you another thing I think that ails us, not just Section 230. No, it's okay, but I had pulled it out today because I talked to a lawyer on the side of a hockey game with my kids years ago when I was trying to figure this out, because I love to solve a problem. And I was like, oh, what's Section 230? And Wired had this article many years ago called, you know, the magical little law, or the secret little law. Maybe someone can put it in the chat. And it basically had a finding. And in legal terms, Ari's going to help us, but a finding is really hard to turn around. And so one of the threads I look at that ails us is this finding. And the finding is enshrined as a permanent part of statutory language, which makes it very hard for a court to rebut later, should a federal judge review it today to decide if the law is unconstitutional. And that finding was that the internet and other interactive computer services have not flourished to the benefit of all Americans. That's what we have to prove, that basically that not all Americans have flourished under this free internet with no guardrails. And I think that's where things get sticky with Section 230, because Section 230 has allowed all of these new media platforms and tech companies to not be liable for any of the information. Whereas the New York Times, for example, when they put up an op-ed around Sarah Palin or about guns, they had a court case where Sarah Palin was suing the New York Times because the op-ed had sort of suggested that Gabby Gifford's shooting was sort of induced by Sarah Palin, you know, mapping out guns. Sarah Palin lost that case last year, but there was a court that you could go and at least have this conversation. Whereas Seth Rogen can just spout off disinformation and anti-vax rhetoric on Spotify, and it takes Joni Mitchell, fellow Canadian, and Neil Young and the Prince of England to shut down Joe Rogan on disinformation. So that's the best way to understand Section 230, is that the New York Times, the Washington Post are liable and the platforms are not. And as a result, all information is allowed to be on there. The only thing is, Ari and I could sue each other if we started defaming each other on Twitter. Did
you get to the other main pieces that ail?
For me, it's journalism. For me, it's journalism. And I think that journalism today has been co-opted by politics. I want to solve that. There are a lot of people in my industry who are really angry at me that I always say that, because they're trying to build these awesome new startups, but then I try and remind them that they're being funded by a super PAC. And so again, I'm not mad at tech for taking the ad dollars. They built the greatest ad machine we've ever seen. It's amazing, and it's made them trillion-dollar companies, and it's bolstered our American economy. If you're a patriot, that's an awesome thing. We have a great economy thanks to those companies. But at the same time, I just feel like we've forgotten that journalism has a role of being nonpartisan, or at least trying to see all sides. And we don't have enough journalists earning a livable wage anymore who are charged in a nonpartisan way to just bring us the facts. And so our communities don't trust media anymore. They're confused by what's an op-ed and what's news. It's all coming at them. And so I don't want to like burn it all down. I just want to put a few guardrails in, and our guardrails not that are going to suppress free speech, but that just can help us help our communities know where to trust information.
Thank you, Heidi. Ari, you've got a challenge because I know that there were a lot of things that Heidi just said that you'd love to respond to. Would you first jump back to this question of what are the core pieces that ails digital discourse now, and then I'll turn to you to respond to some of what Heidi named.
Sure. You know, free expression is messy. It always has been, it always will be. And that's kind of the point of it all. And I think, what we're seeing is the messiest it's ever been because we are the most connected that we have ever been. And that is kind of you can't get around that ultimate, the more we're talking to each other, the more the messiness factor is going to ratchet up. And I think the problem is just a completely human problem. And that is that we don't listen to each other and we don't trust each other. And I think that what happens online in terms of the toxicity of discourse is just a direct reflection of the fact that we have increasingly come to see people who hold viewpoints that differ from ours as not just wrong on those particular things, but like as unhinged, crazy mole people, screaming at the streetlights. And we don't want to take the time to understand where they're coming from. We don't want to take the time to convince them that they're wrong. I'm as guilty as this as anyone at times, but a lot of times we just don't feel like we have the energy or the responsibility to actually engage in the kind of conversation that is geared towards convincing people that our idea is right and their idea is wrong, and like actually convincing, not telling, but persuading. So I think that we've lost a lot of the ability to actually have good faith debate with people who we disagree with very strongly. And, when you say something like that, it always devolves into, well, what good do you think arguing with Nazis would have done? But there's a whole lot of space in between most discourse on the internet and literally arguing with a Nazi in the 1940s. I mean, there's just a whole universe of difference in between those things. So, I think that the problem isn't the fact that we're talking online. I think the problem is that we are flawed people handed these, tools with which we can communicate with anyone and everyone, which I should say, the tools are wonderful. I am very internet optimistic. I'm bullish on technology and progress.
Me too, Ari. Me too.
Yeah, I know. And I think that it gets lost a bit in all the consistent headlines of, platform this, messaging app that. It becomes almost ingrained that the ability to talk to one another at such scale is inherently bad. Look at all the problems it's causing. And that causes us to shift the attention away from the things that can actually reduce those harms onto just saying, well, it's all the platform's fault. We take no responsibility for this. And I think that's bad, because I don't think that the tools that we use to communicate really caused us to act the way that we do. We have to take responsibility for that. So I think really fixing humans, as kind of endless as that task would be, is where we need to focus. I do want to go back just for a second to kind of run over section 230 again, just to kind of be extra clear. Section 230 is a very simple law when it comes down to it. It says that the people who post potentially defamatory or otherwise tortious content on the internet are responsible, not the services that merely host that speech. And people make the comparison, as Heidi did, to newspapers a lot. But when you think about the billions of pieces of content that go up on each platform every day, there simply is no way that they could perform the kind of checking that, say, the New York Times does before it, figures out where in the layout it's going to put a particular piece, without actually just hamstringing the entire communicative enterprise in the first place. So that's kind of one of the underlying rationales of Section 230. But importantly, what Section 230 also does is protect platforms that say, okay, we want to set these content standards for our service. And another site says, we want to have these other standards, and say, you're not going to actually enforce them perfectly all the time. That's just simply impossible given the scale. So we're going to protect you for saying we want these rules and then not necessarily being able to execute at 110%. So we want these platforms to compete with each other on their different policies. And the way that Section 230 fosters free speech on the internet is that it allows these platforms to actually host the speech of third parties without being subject to basically ruinous litigation every step of the way. And in that sense, it has been a resounding success. And I'm sure we'll talk more about it, later on. But the legislative findings are a little bit less interesting, because they basically just set out, this is why we're doing this. This is, what we're, going to be trying to address with this legislation. It doesn't have particular legal effect. And, there's some people have argued that Section 230 is unconstitutional. I find those arguments very unpersuasive, and frankly, just a little bit silly. But, the findings themselves aren't really going to come into play in most of this.
But would you say that the internet has been useful for everyone? Would you say that finding, if I read the language again, like when you think of kids who are, young girls who are basically all have eating disorders being sort of spiraled into, videos and influencers talking about not eating, or there's the case right now about fentanyl being sold to a kid online. There's a lot of hate and polarization. I mean, at what point do we just say, okay, this is really happening? We've been at this since 1996. So we're 27 years in and we haven't had really any regulation around the internet. And I'm not a regulator. Like, I'm actually very pro-capitalism. So I don't really love a regulation, but we just don't have any levers anymore. I mean, the lever I keep throwing out is, why don't we pay a per capita number of journalists to be investigative journalists? You and I both have shared this before. I don't want the government to be paying for that. So the platforms are trillion-dollar companies. They give all these media companies, the Washington Post, New York Times, they are all under NDA, but it's not a hidden secret that they're getting 10 to 20 million dollars from Google and Facebook to keep their content up. I mean, why don't we just open this up and say, all right, we have electrical grids, we have water reservoirs. Let's have investigative journalists that are nonpartisan per capita in every city in America, and let's pay through some sort of a code or formula or something. Because if you guys are saying we're just going to have total free speech, we're not going to have any walls around it, we're going to have no gates, then we have journalism obliterated because we have no revenue model anymore. We all know subscription and donation isn't working. So what's the solution? Like, what do we have left to pull as a string besides like maybe an allowance under an NDA if you're a big guy from Google and Facebook? Like, well, there's
a lot to unpack there, because I think the issue of journalism is separate from the issue of, quote unquote, bad content. Bad content has been out there long before the internet. People.
Journalism is suffering because it doesn't have a revenue model.
Well, no, I'm talking about things like, you mentioned eating disorders and things like that,
Right, but if you could have some of that content, but you could turn up the dial as you can at these platform companies and make sure that there's reputable Reuters, AP, Washington Post, Boston Globe, Miami Herald, like some authoritative newsrooms that are doing research, who are allowed to get as much airtime. It's like, if you just live on junk food, like, I feel like that mom at 50, like, I'm literally like, guys, let's get a diet down. Like, let's have some vegetables, let's have some sugar, let's have some carbs, let's have some water. Like, let's just balance it out. If you don't want to revise Section 230, create a livable wage program for journalism. I mean, we just need something, Ari. It's not.
I mean, I don't know how journalism is going to fix teenage girls seeing content that, relates to body image issues like that.
We know that that's where they're going. We can cover
Heidi,
a story.
We'll let Ari share a full perspective here. And then
and so there's a lot of different things in there. The bad content has always been around, and platforms are doing things that they consistently get hauled in front of Congress to explain what they're doing, and they explain what they're doing. The problem is it's incredibly tricky, and Congress found out just how tricky it was last session when they tried to pass the Kids Online Safety Act, which would have spectacularly backfired in so many different ways, including preventing kids from actually accessing harm reduction materials, as while saying, okay, well, you're not going to be able to access any content about eating disorders. Yeah, platforms are going to block everything, including the harm reduction materials. So it's really tricky because it's hard to suss out for each particular piece of content whether something is harmful or helpful. And it's going to be harmful or helpful. That perspective is going to change per person because everyone responds differently to every piece of content. I don't know that turning a dial and increasing the visibility of other content is necessarily gonna do anything, and I think that it's probably already being done to some extent. I'm not sure that. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to give Heidi an opportunity to jump in. I know early on in your comments there were some things that you really wanted to respond to.
I guess I just keep hearing from tech, who I actually remember I'm a fan of, and I hope we can talk about ChatGPT before this hour's up, it's just like everything seems to be an excuse about why you shouldn't be regulated. And then it's just not getting fixed. And so, I'll give you some numbers. Okay, so the total newsrooms in America, if you count all the NPR stations, ABC, NBC, all the small locals that you all tune into, your papers, not weeklies, just dailies, we have about 3,000 newsrooms in America. We have lost more jobs in journalism than the coal industry, and we're not reforming to a new energy in journalism, unless you want to call it third-party content. And you have basically 85,000, Pew put out, there are about 85,000 people who work in journalism right now in cable, newspapers, digital. I did the math on that. I was like, okay, well, what if we paid $100,000 to all of those 85,000 people? That is a livable wage in a number of places, not probably in Chicago and Boston. That's pretty hard to live on. But, let's say $100,000 to be a full-time journalist. And to all 85,000 that are out there, that's $8.5 billion a year. So let's just say, okay, let's take $8.5 billion a year from the platforms and pay for journalism. And it won't be partisan. It won't be coming in through donors and super PACs. In other countries, this isn't the model I'm suggesting, but I think it's important for us just to know that in Canada, there is $30 spent per capita per person for the CBC. In the UK, you're forced to pay, that'll never work in the US, you're forced to pay as a family for public media. It works out to about $60 a person per capita. And in places like Japan and Norway, you're at about $120 per person. So I'm going to give you 3 seconds to guess what we pay in the US. So 30 in Canada, 60 in UK, 120 in Norway, 120 in Japan. In the US, we pay $1.50 per head for public media. Now, under Joe Biden, it was raised 25 cents from $1.25 to $1.50, but that's the country we live in. And a lot of us love that. We love the capitalist system. We don't really want big government. We don't want to, a paternal system. But the fact is we have $1.50 going to public media. And all the other media today that is emerging that I've mapped out shows that it's from donors. A lot of those donors have partisan bias. And so as a result, we don't really have those golden days of the Wash Post and the New York Times and the Boston Globe, where you had a newsroom full of people who probably had a bias, but their goal was to do investigative news to protect and hold power to account in a democracy. And I just don't know how we get to that if it's not the government, because we don't want a paternal system. and then the platforms aren't willing to give the money transparently. And then they're saying, you know, let's just use third-party content. I'm just confused on what to do next. I'm looking for levers.
Well,
Heidi,
I find it kind of funny because, you know, we've heard a lot about the news media saying, well, you know, big tech is stealing all of our money. But just the other week, there was an article about how referral traffic and thus ad revenue had dropped drastically because Twitter ended its moments feature. So it seems like they are making some money, enough to complain about it when a feature drops that gives them the referral traffic, maybe just perhaps not as much money as they like. Now, don't get me wrong, on a normative philosophical level, I am not opposed to, you know, equitable, you know, agreements between, you know, tech platforms and the media as to what should be paid. But I think the devil is in the details, and how do we get there? Because, you know, there's just a lot of different self-interested angles going around here, but I don't think that we should let doing something be the enemy of doing something good.
So do you just keep it as is right now? Is that working?
You know, I wish I had an answer for you.
I don't know, David, what do you think are some other ways, you know, we can make it work? I've mapped out the media in the US. We have a problem in that Murdoch, certainly with Fox, is committed to being a GOP voice. So are the Sinclairs. We also have a problem that we now have emergent left-leaning news that's being sponsored by PACs. If you go online this morning, I was getting in trouble with Tara McGowan at Acronym, who's funded by Soros and Hoffman. She says, we're not a PAC, Courier News is actually just trying to bring up underrepresented voices. You have a lot of money from Google and Facebook going. If you go look at my indexes, just Google Heidi Legg, Harvard Media Indexes, and you can see I've mapped out all 240 new digital nonprofit news. So we have, I think, it's a pipe dream, outlets, and it shows you who pays, and a lot of it is people who have, like, you know, that I'm not going to call them out, but they have a partisan view. And then we're down to a bunch of rich families who are bringing us the Boston Globe with the Henrys, and the Taylors in Minneapolis, and Bezos with the Washington Post, the Sulzberger. You're never gonna get bias out of reporting, though. That's a pipe dream, because reporting happens by humans, and humans have biases. I think if you're never going to get.
I'm going to jump in for just a second.
And say, be investigative, and here's $150,000 a year to do that.
You're still going to get bias if you do that.
Sure, but they're not going to be partisan. They're just going to go.
Yes, they will. Of course they will.
I'm going to jump. Excuse me. I'm going to jump in for a moment. I'm so glad that we can be competing with ideas so fiercely, and both of you are still smiling. That's great.
We knew we were going to do this.
I think I heard Ari say that you're open to opportunities for new business models that could support local journalism more strongly. You're just a little bit challenged by some of the ideas that are out there now. I wanted to test, Heidi, whether there is an element from your perspective, to Ari's point, that a good chunk of what's happening comes from the broader social elements: social ills, isolation, social disconnection, political dysfunction, divisiveness more broadly, maybe to blame. Do you see that as connected at all, or is that really a different issue from the ills of digital discourse?
Totally connected. And I don't really want to have any authority come down and tell us what we can and can't say. I'm a huge Twitter user. I don't want someone to tell me what I can and can't say. I would just like the platforms to compensate that with some journalism. I always say that if like 1 in 5 posts could come from a reputable newsroom, that might just help the feed. I worked on a project at Harvard with some graduate students, and they were looking for ways to interrupt people who are constantly in a vortex of disinformation. Is there a way to sort of, help them snap out of that? And I think that I see that lever as really good newsrooms, and making a commitment that every 5th post is going to be from a reputable newsroom, instead of like Facebook tried with their tab, but it was like this separate tab. And Twitter, it seems like I'm seeing more news, but I don't know if that's just because what I follow. But I do think we could mandate that, because I don't want to shut down the internet and free speech.
Can I probe you on that idea a little bit? Because, say you follow a whole bunch of people. Let's take Facebook, for example. You're friends with a whole bunch of people. What happens if nobody that you're friends with posts news articles? Do you think that Facebook should be inserting news articles anyway, despite the fact, or just things that other people have posted?
I wouldn't be against them at all, saying every 5th post is from a newsroom and mixing those newsrooms up. I think that would be really useful if somebody who watches CNBC all the time was seeing a Fox News post.
I mean, I
think like any diversity is better. Mono anything is not good. Like mono anything is never good. So.
Yeah. I see some user pushback saying, well, I don't use Facebook for news. I don't want news in my Facebook. I want pictures of my grandkids or whatever. And that's what I'm here for. So I could see some pushback there, but I'd say
or we can regulate.
We're maybe not like 100% far apart, because I think that it's absolutely fine to be proposing these ideas that you think platforms should adopt. Where I start to get more concerned is when there are proposals for the government to come in and say, platforms, you have to make it so that every 5th post is a news article. That's the no-go zone for me.
That's why I love the Convergence series we've had. I mean, I know we're not talking about everybody that's in the room, but there's people there from industry and from civil groups and from universities. And Ari and I've had some of these conversations before, so we knew this was going to be spicy. And I think that just thinking about that, like, how do we get the industry to get there before the government gets involved? Because I don't really want the government to get involved in it either. It gets watered down, or it gets, partisan.
Ari, do you see benefit there, just in terms of forget what we're telling people to do, just making sure that there's sufficient discussion so that the platforms really hear where the rubs are and can consider what to do about them?
Well, yeah, I think there's a lot of value there. And I think that's kind of one of actually the underpinning values of Section 230, is that the marketplace and consumer pressure should drive platforms to adopt better policies, because people are sick and tired of bad ones. And in that respect, I think it's incumbent on us to be thinking of ways we want platforms to be better and exerting consumer pressure, because ultimately these are businesses and they respond to financial and consumer pressure that, coming from, people who say, well, if things keep going this way, I'm going to jump ship for a different platform. I think, if we want to complain about how things are, we absolutely have to be doing this kind of thing. I think it's really important. I don't think that people always get kind of a little bit confused when I, talk about it. Well, how terrible I think some of the proposed regulation is. The fact that the government can't force companies to do something does not mean that we shouldn't be asking the platforms to do these things voluntarily.
Bingo,
that
but
is good.
It's so hard, Ari, for someone like me to be heard. And I mean, even I look at like funding to work at a university. For those that don't know, to do research, you need a gift or a grant. Well, the gifts and grants don't come in for someone like me who's poking around trying to find out who owns the media and why the platforms need to behave better. It goes to things that they care about, like content moderation. I've watched it for 4 years, and I haven't had one tech company come and offer to fund my work, and that's fine. It's fine, but it's just like, so now I'm just sort of out there on my own.
Tech company money anyway.
I would. I just want to keep doing the work. You have to be funded. So it's just like, I'll give you an example. Gallup and Knight Foundation did a study last fall, and only a quarter of Americans have ever paid for news. And when you start looking at the ages, it's kind of crazy. Like 15% of people between 50 and 64 have paid for local news or national news, but only like 9% of people between 30 and 49, and 7% who are in their 20s. And so that's not working. So then they said, okay, well, what do you think is a good way to fund news? And over half of the respondents said they want it to be funded by advertising because it just feels less partisan. Right now, it's people over $150,000 a year who are paying for news. So we actually have an infodemic where we have people who can afford it, like myself, having multiple subscriptions at the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Atlantic, the Economist. And so I'm getting this totally different access to information than the average person. And that starts to become a national security issue. And so I do think these are businesses, and these tech platforms don't really want the New York Times and the Washington Post to win. They compete with them, but those ad dollars would make a less partisan place. And we haven't seen the tech companies try and share that ad dollar money or help rebuild the ad business for the journalism. Instead, they're doing this hush money NDA stuff. So it's like, it is a business, but I think we have to be honest about what no guardrails and no regulation has created. And that is a complete bifurcation in who is allowed to be intelligently educated through information, who isn't, and that's people with money. And that's not fair. And it's not good for the country.
Well, so maybe one of the solutions there is, because the information is out there. You can get the information. The problem is that some of our less well-off communities don't get the same kind of education and training in finding the information as people who go to, $40,000 a year private high schools do. And
I went to public school in a small town in Canada, and I went to public university, and I just happened to be able to afford the news. So it's just like, I don't think that's the right way to look at it. I think that we need to introduce it to them, and we need to make it affordable to them. And that is the platforms. They have the $1 trillion. These are businesses.
I mean, I'm gonna lay my cards on the table. I pay for some local news. Block Club Chicago, shout out to them, do a fantastic job.
Yeah,
and the Sun-Times just adopted, and I grew up in a Chicago Tribune household, and they've since been basically gutted and turned into anything but the Chicago Tribune. And the Sun-Times just adopted a public ownership model. And I've actually seen the quality of its journalism increase greatly. And I think, and I know that there's a lot of naysaying about the public ownership model, and there are valid concerns about it. But I do think that these are all options we should explore. But I think also, the information is out there in a lot of instances for free. We need to figure out how to get people looking for it and finding it. Part of the problem maybe is that too many people are reliant on their relatively small social networks for getting a lot of the news, instead of going out there and searching for more information. Which baffles me personally, because I came of age basically as the web was kind of maturing, and I remember the just wild wonder and joy of exploring the back then rather limited internet, and just figuring out what I could find out there was such a crazy thing for a kid who had a set of hardcover encyclopedias in their bedroom as a child. It was wild. And
I think that's where you and I could actually find some common
I think we need to
ground,
re-inspire that kind of sense of wonder.
Yeah.
I think that's right, and it makes me want to turn to the AI and that whole phenomenon. But before I do that, Heidi, I want to check with you about how you think some of the historical analogs play here. We know, we saw radio be publicly debated as something that needed huge amounts of protection when television started coming on, and we saw the broadcast stations wanting protection and to be built back up when cable came online. We've seen a lot of that in the wake of internet disruption. How much do you think this disruption of the news media is actually healthy and gets sort of solved generationally? And how much of it is, as you're saying, how much of the damage that you're talking about is linear and can't be fixed except for intervention.
Well, I love technology, and I'm glad we're going to talk about new technologies. And I think technology is something that is really important and innovative, because I believe in innovation. I think that's how societies get better. That's why the West is so strong. It's because we've innovated. But I feel like all of those other media products, they prioritize news. And so what's changed for me that's different today than those other mediums is that it doesn't feel like journalism is being held up as an important pillar. And I say to people in the business world, of whom I'm around a lot, which is, if you don't have a democracy, you don't have a free market. And if you don't have a free market, it means that those contracts are going to go to the political person's brother or sister. And so one of the great things we have in the West that we have to remember is that we have a free press and we have a free market, but we can't continue to have a free press if there isn't a livable wage for journalists. So all of this conversation we've had, if there was one thing that's ailing the internet in my mind, and that we're missing as a blind spot by the new tech generation, of which I was part, and in San Francisco working for Niehaus Ryan Group, for those that remember it, in 1996, is that we aren't prioritizing a livable wage for journalists. And if you look at who the platforms are funding, they've funded a lot of underrepresented voices, which is great, because newsrooms were full of people that looked like me and Ari and you. And so that needed to be disrupted. But to then not give them enough money to actually be a robust newsroom, that's actually more frustrating to those groups. And so my call to action for this new technology that is so awesome and exciting is, don't forget that without journalism, you will not have free markets and democracy. And so we have to figure out, instead of feeling like the New York Times or the cable guys or Washington Post or whoever the big competitor is of old media, that you think they're just trying to bring you down because you're the new tech guys. Like, they prioritize journalism. Even with the fairness doctrine, we had both sides in cable news. There has to be a budget for news, and it cannot be small budgets that placate one group and, NDA to make New York Times not go and have a lobby group, regulate you. Like, we need a formula for news, and JCPA isn't perfect. It's a great bill going through that Amy Klobuchar put through. I don't know Amy, but thank you for putting that through. And I feel like it could be fixed. I wish so that the hedge funds can't just take whatever they want out of it. That's one of the arguments that people put out there about JCPA, is that it's going to be a payment for news, a code payment that platforms pay for news by use. They're saying, oh, well, it will just go to their lining the hedge fund pockets, not to journalists. And the same in Canada, we have Bill C-18, and it's going to the Senate now. Our Senate in Canada is nominated, not elected, so a little less controversial, so it should pass. And I just think put an amendment in there that says that 20% or 30%, whatever the number is, has to go to a livable wage for journalists. That's what we need to see in this new technology.
I would say just a couple of things. Well, first of all, just a minor correction. The fairness doctrine never applied to cable. Only applied to
You're right, network TV. Thank you, Ari. You're
TV.
Absolutely right.
But we've had this conversation before. I am very much on the other side of the JCPA for a number of reasons. I don't think, however, that it's unfixable. I think that is maybe one of the problems that you mentioned is, well, first of all, it only increases the likelihood that hedge funds will snap up smaller newsrooms, gut the newsrooms, and then just use them as proxy votes in the cartels. And then there's also the issue of that it actually could harm the information ecosystem by forcing payments for the privilege of determining, oh, this is a news site that is not reliable and we don't want its content, and yet you still have to pay for it. But we could talk for 3 hours about all the JCPOAs.
We could, but the end can't be. Go ahead.
But I think that we have to prioritize making sure we get it right over doing something right this second. I do think that journalists should be getting a livable wage. I wonder what you think about platforms like Substack that kind of give people the opportunity to make it as a journalist. And, you know, kind of new models of journalism that don't necessarily revolve around the traditional newsroom. And whether you think that plays a role in maybe solutions, or if you think that it's harmful.
No, I love Substack for its setup. When I was building the editorial from 2012 to 2016, 18, 6 years, I used to run around and say, I need a price gun. Like you put a price tag on something, because I couldn't charge for these interviews. And then I found a paywall out of this great little outfit startup in Wisconsin, and it was clunky and there was friction. And I was like, oh, why can't I just swipe like iTunes? Like, why isn't my content? Why can't I sell my journalism? It was so frustrating, which is how I ended up at the Kennedy School, because I was frustrated that it wasn't solvable. The problem with Substack, like self-publishing, like podcasts, is that it's winner takes all. So they'll give like Casey Newton a salary, or you know, Paul Wells is writing a great one, a Substack out of Canada. I don't know if they're giving him a salary, but that's a great one. There's lots of great ones out there. I subscribe to a few. I pay $50 a year for a few of them. Again, that's the cost of high quality information, which doesn't seem fair that not everybody can have it. And the problem is that it's not sustainable. Like, these are like great ideas, but the tech companies never seem to be the ones to put the money into sustaining the news. They like to build the infrastructure and then have a few winners and then take the profit off that and then sell it to a bigger company.
I mean, maybe that's partially our fault for not wanting to pay for the news.
People can't afford it, Ari.
Well, and you know, that is part of the problem. Absolutely. But I think
I added up all of our subscriptions. It's crazy. Like, the cost of being informed is like, you know, $680 a year. If you just subscribe to the Boston Globe, which is a fabulous local newspaper, and once the deals run out, or the New York Times or in the Washington Post just laid off another group of people, like, it's expensive for people.
Yeah. But I think we're also in a time where even people who can't afford the news are looking for ways to evade paywalls and this and that, right, because it's not convenient to pay for the news.
Well, there's a lot of content.
You guys remember when Napster scared everybody so much that artists weren't ever going to be able to make money again? And how disruptive that flip to streaming was. Oh, yeah. Do you see it as possible that the technology itself is going to be driving the new model rather than trying to,
I think so,
sort of figure out what the model is and try to make it happen?
And here's the thing, Heidi, if there was like a magical pot of money that we could draw from to—
You mean the $1 trillion platforms?
But that's not a magical pot of money, because it is somebody's money. And you know, it comes down to the fact that, you know, okay, it's all well and good to say, okay, well, we want high quality information and we want it to provide it to people for free. You know, normatively, I would say yes, great, let's do that. But practically, that's a tall order. So, you know, I think—
How about if every
there has to be a balance?
How about every fifth short form video, post, whatever, is from a reputable newsroom? We'll all help figure out what's reputable. It could be that you have to have so many journalists with a livable wage and a code of ethics in your newsroom. And then let's get some micropayments going. You know, I talked to Sesame in Sweden. I talked to Dominic Young in the UK from Axate. Let's have some micropayments, because if all these people aren't paying for news, maybe they'll all pay for that one Meghan Markle, Prince Harry story that came out of the New Yorker. So let's just—
I would be okay if we had no more of those stories personally, but I know you wanted to talk about AI though, so I don't want to like—
Yeah, I do. Okay, so if
you know what? Can somebody? I would love it if someone would tee us up. We have 10 minutes left. Let's see if in 5 or 6 minutes we can actually describe what's happening with AI. GPT chat, and then how that impacts what we're talking about in terms of digital discourse, and what we potentially need to solve there.
Heidi, I'm going to let you do the rundown. You've thought a lot about this.
Well, I'm excited about it because whenever I have conversations with tech, it seems to be that it ends with, we don't want to be regulated and we don't want to pay for news. So if that is always going to be the answer, and that they're never going to be regulated and they're never going to pay for news unless it's hush money under an NDA, then ChatGPT starts to make me really excited, because remember, my goal is better quality information for more people. And so I've talked to a lot of people around me at MIT and Harvard who are very nervous about disinformation from ChatGPT. And I think we should all be nervous about that. But let's be idealistic for a second. If we only have a very small budget for news because platforms won't pay for it and they don't want to be regulated and are going to stop regulation with lobby money, then if we only have a small bit of money, if ChatGPT can start to churn out some of the content that might be easy to churn out, so don't get mad at me, sports fans, but like sports scores, finance, real estate, news of weather, traffic, and breaking news. So here's the thing that I want you to tell me, Ari, if I've got this right. I know ChatGPT only goes till 2021. And basically what it is, everybody, is a bot. Most of you already know this, but it's a bot that's reading what's out there on the internet and coming up with pretty awesome answers. So if
you said 2021 and we're past that.
My understanding is it only reads as far as 2021.
Oh, reads.
Yes, it can't get information today yet. But if it could, this is what I want Ari to tell me if this could work. Could it be that when the protests happened in Brazil last week, when their January 6th moment, could it be that all of the third-party posting and content happening on the internet, that actually that could be a better reportage of what's happening on the ground in a climate disaster or in a breaking news moment than the man or woman on the street with like the local newspaper or radio station, because you can get so many inputs quickly. And if that can happen, then I'm like, wow, every category, but like a human element story or investigative news can be done by ChatGPT, which means our limited resources in journalism, since the platforms won't pay for it, can go towards investigative newsrooms. That's the plus. That's the little dream that I'm seeing this week.
I mean, if we could find a way to make that work, that would be earth moving. I think that you'd have to figure out a way to control the universe of information it draws from, because say the protests in Brazil, you're going to get people, from the protester side and from the other side, and they're going to say like directly contradictory things about it. And the machine learning is going to have to figure out a way to reconcile and actually, sometimes I get the sinking feeling that there's no real way to avoid the human judgment element of it all, and that it might be a long time. And it's certainly possible that it will happen, perhaps even likely that it will happen, that AI will get so good that we will trust it as much as the reporter on the street. I think that's a long way down the road, but it's actually interesting because I was thinking about this just recently. I know you brought it up when we were talking about this conversation, but I'm in the market for a new mattress, and I have been like searching around and because a lot of these mattresses sold online, like some of them you can try in stores, but some of them you can't. So I'm looking around for reviews, and through doing that, I've come to learn that a lot of these mattress review sites are like literal scams. They are like run by the mattress companies without disclosing and this. But it also struck me how easy it would be for like ChatGPT to create all of these fake review sites and like link referral sites, those old like link referral scam blogs and whatever, to create content that looks like it was written by a professional mattress reviewer and really is just a giant advertisement. So, this is kind of separate from the news thing, but I think the FTC is going to have its hands full when it comes to AI in terms of kind of deceptive practices. So I think we have a lot to figure out with AI before we trust it. And, I know CNET ran this experiment recently and had to issue a whole bunch of corrections because the financial advice that the AI, it wasn't ChatGPT, but the AI they used to write their financial services articles spit out a bunch of nonsense.
But I sort of loved it that Red Ventures was trying it on something that wasn't going to like bring down the house subjects, you know. It's coming, like we can't stop it. So I'm like, how can we use it? And I need there to be more money in the system for nonpartisan investigative news. I need ProPublicas in every single city. And I don't think it should just be the donor class that's funding that. You don't want it to be the government. I grew up on CBC. I'm okay with a little bit more than $1.50 per capita, but I really think that the platforms need to pay for news.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we can get the AI to be doing like basic fact-based reporting, like you said, in some of those categories, yeah, it could free up resources. And
that's what we have a resource problem in journalism. That's the problem. And it's been so as a result of no revenue model, journalism is being co-opted very quickly by partisan super PACs and funders. Yeah, unfortunately, the problem is that, you know, the partisan elements will always seek to kind of control and utilize whatever resources or whatever technologies come. You know, there ain't no stopping that.
Heidi and Ari, I wish we could go on for a lot longer. And I know that you're pleased that you'll actually have many, many more hours to do that in the Convergence Collaborative. I hope everybody's trying to imagine right now what it's like to bring dozens of leaders and experts with widely disparate perspectives into a room.
It's great. Everyone should do it.
I'd love to conclude just backing up to that. What do you feel like each of you are gaining from being in a conversation with people that really disagree with your perspective? And does it hold any hope or opportunity for the future of public discourse?
I mean, I think that and this is, you know, not limited to just this conversation, but anytime you are in a face-to-face, good faith conversation, that's the important thing, is this dialogue has been incredibly good faith on everyone's part, which is just so refreshing. But when you're in that kind of good faith, face-to-face conversation, you start to, you know, you immediately recognize that the people who have different perspectives from you, they believe those things for a reason. It's not that they just decided one day that they're going to, you know, disagree with everything you hold dear. They have their own reasons, and it's worth listening to. And the only way you're going to ever be able to defend your own idea is to be able to grapple with their arguments against your idea. And that's kind of the whole principle of free expression. I think it's just been a wonderful experience that has perhaps not changed my views, but has changed how I think about my views and how I explain my views and the way I need to meet people where they are in talking about those views. It's been such a thoroughly positive experience, start to middle, I guess we're at now, but that, you know, it's so valuable to talk to people who disagree with you. And I really think that if more people did that, we might not be needing this conversation, but
Heidi, I'm sorry, we only have 1 minute.
I feel lucky every day that I get to live in America and Canada. We're very lucky in the West, and the fact that Ari's out there being a libertarian in his views makes us freer. And I'm just trying to make them ensure we have some vegetables, so we keep it free and democratic. I think we're very lucky, and I love the Convergence series. It's been very insightful.
With that, I want to thank both of you for a really informative and passionate discussion. And I'm looking forward to what comes out of the dialogue. And thanks to everyone that was tuning in and watching. Appreciate it.
Bye, Ari.
All right. Thank you so much, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.